Let's talk about one of the most powerful and frankly concerning cycles happening in the U.S. economy right now. It's this fiscal trap that's been quietly setting itself for years. And now, well, it's getting pretty much impossible to ignore. And it all kicks off with one single staggering number.
34%. Just let that sink in for a second. 34%. What on earth in the federal budget could possibly grow that fast?
That's it. In just the last 2 years, the single fastest growing line item for the U.S. government wasn't some new program, it wasn't some big emergency spending. Nope, it was just the interest it has to pay on the national debt, and that cost is absolutely exploding.
So, to really wrap our heads around what's going on, we first have to get a feel for the sheer scale of these numbers. Because, honestly, figures this big can just kind of lose their meaning. So let's try to put them in context.
This is the bill. Every single year. $1 trillion. That is what the United States is now spending annually just to service its debt. And let's be clear, this isn't paying down the actual debt, not a penny of it. This is only the interest payment. Think of it like the minimum payment on a credit card the size of a country.
It's a totally fair question, right? How do you even picture a number that huge? Well, maybe the best way is to compare it to other things the government spends a whole lot of money on.
For decades, and I mean decades, the biggest expense in the whole government was national defense. Not anymore. The U.S. now spends more on interest on its debt than it does on its entire defense budget. And get this, it's actually more than the budgets for national defense and veterans benefits combined. That is just wild.
Okay, so we've seen the symptom, right? These interest payments are just skyrocketing. But to get to the real problem, we have to look at what's causing it, and that's buried deep in the very structure of the federal budget itself. I mean, it's the first thing everyone thinks, isn't it? If you're spending too much money, just, spend less. But when it comes to the federal budget, the reality is not even close to being that simple.
And this right here shows you exactly why. Take a look at the whole federal budget pie. Only about 30% of it is what we call discretionary. That's the stuff Congress actually debates every year, things like defense, education, transportation. The other 70%, that massive slice, is called mandatory spending.
So what does mandatory really mean? It means the 70% of the entire budget is basically on autopilot. It's locked in by law, it just keeps getting spent year after year without a new vote unless Congress decides to pass a whole new law to change it. And what's in this giant mandatory spending bucket? Well, it's the big ones: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. For a lot of politicians, touching these programs is the third rail. You just don't do it. Which means that 70% of the budget is effectively locked in, and it's set to grow every single year automatically. And this is where all the pieces of the puzzle snap together. When you combine that massive mandatory spending with these exploding interest payments, you create this dangerous, self-reinforcing cycle, a feedback loop. Let's call it what it is, the interest trap.
Okay, here's how the trap works. Step 1. That high, automatic, mandatory spending means the government is always spending more than it brings in. That creates a deficit. Step 2. To cover that gap, the government has to borrow more money, which makes the national debt bigger. Step 3. A bigger debt, naturally, means bigger interest payments. And now for the kicker, Step 4. Those bigger interest payments themselves become a new kind of mandatory spending, which makes the original deficit even worse. And then the whole cycle starts over again, but this time from an even worse position.
And that is the trap. The problem is now feeding itself. The interest on the debt has become a major driver of new debt. It's a spiral that makes balancing the budget almost impossible without making some fundamental, really painful changes to those core drivers.
Which brings us to the political reality of all of this. Any real solution, whether it's cutting spending on those huge mandatory programs or raising taxes in a big way, well, it involves what are pretty accurately described as ugly, unpopular choices. And, nobody in Washington wants to be the one to deliver that kind of news. And that's really the central question this whole interest trap leaves us with, isn't it? When the math just doesn't bend and every real solution is politically toxic, the easiest path, the path of least resistance, is to just do nothing. To let the cycle keep spinning faster and faster, the only real question left is, for how much longer?